Hey all, and welcome back to Radical Slice. My name is Eric. I think this marks the beginning of the second half. Maybe it'll be half. Maybe it won't be that much content, but the second half of the Kung Fu Project, where I'm trying to recreate something like the old Kung Fu game from the NES on Pico-8. So the initial set of requirements that we kind of set are already done. And in the previous series, that's where I stopped. I kind of left it, as a very skeletal game. But what I'm thinking right now is I'd like to push this one a little bit further and make it a little bit more, I don't know, user friendly. Less of just like a dev prototype and more of like something you could actually play. And so for the next few episodes, we're going to be working on, some graphical improvements, some new mechanics, things like that. In this episode, we're going to focus mostly on things related to life and death. So we're going to update the player's health bar, just like a graphical update. We'll also add a more, I don't know, a nicer looking player death reaction, and also some really basic player hit flash. So without further ado, let's get started. So, player health bar. What I'm thinking is kind of in the upper right corner where we currently have health. Let's make this larger. Where we currently have health and then the numerical value, we'll just draw like a nice standard rectangle that fills up as it has health. I kind of want to. So Pico 8 does have like a rect function to draw rectangles, but it kind of gives like I want rounded corners, if I'm being honest. So I think I'm going to try to hack together something with just lines and then fill it in with the rectangle. I think that'll work. And because we set the health value to 100, it'll probably be easier. I don't want to use a 100 pixel long health bar, so we'll probably just make it 50 pixels long, and then every pixel will be two units of health. If that looks too gigantic, we will just switch the default health value to 99 and we'll make a 33 pixel long health bar to deal with that situation. All right, away we go. I ended up doing pretty much exactly what I said. I just drew two horizontal lines and then two vertical lines slightly outside them so that it makes kind of a box with rounded corners. And then I'm filling that in with the rect fill function using the player's health divided by two and then floored. This is like the automatically round division. And then I just increment by 13 because it's the offset where the rectangle starts. So it'll be 50 pixels long when the player is at full health. I added some extra excitement where I copied the player sprite head over here and cut his shoulders off so I could put the head icon next to the health bar. So the result is this. Now that looks pretty good. I don't know if I want to go with a black background for the sort of menu stuff yet or not, but for now, I think this will work out okay. So I actually have not tried this. Oh, and I also decided to make like an outline around the health bar, like have it be a different color. I played around with some different combinations and I kind of like this one the best. I did also play with having a white outline around the player's head icon in the upper left there, but it just was like too much and I had to kind of shrink the shape of his head and it made him look weird. So I'm not going to do that for right now. So yeah, Let's see if it works when I like take damage and stuff. Oh, dude. Okay, cool. That's awesome. All right, great. Oh, it sort of. Oh, okay. It sort of gets stuck and plays the game over sad sound or the player dying sound when there's still 1 unit of health left on there. So I'll probably have to do something about that. Hold on a second. Okay, that wasn't so bad. I basically just had to wrap the thing in an if statement. Let me show you. Yeah, so if the player's health is a non-negative, then it'll draw it. I think what was going on here was um, rect fill 13. So if player's health is 0, it'll divide by 2. That gives us a 0 plus 13. So the x1 and x2 coordinates are the same value. And in Pico-8, that means it's going to draw like a 1 pixel width rectangle. So that was the issue. So I just kind of like added a quick cheat. So now when we run out of health, oh, it goes to 0 and then we respawn. So perfect. Pretty stoked about that one. Next, I think what would be cool is if when you die, right now the player just kind of stands there and then you respawn. So what would be cooler is if when you die, like the player has some little a different sprite or maybe falls off the screen or something like that. So let me try to draw a quick sprite to represent that, and then we'll see if we can get the player to fall off the screen. Okay. I mean, I guess this will do for now. He kind of looks like he's lying down, but I think this will work for. I just want to like kind of send our guy here falling off the bottom of the screen, kind of like maybe backwards and but mostly downwards. So I think this will work. Not everything lines up the way I wanted it to, but whatever. This will do for now. Let me integrate this. Probably what we'll need to do here is, if I remember correctly, I think the player doesn't have like a dead state, do they? Hold on a second. Now, in a sort of like interesting philosophical statement, the player is kind of unaware of their own death. So we subtract health, but then in main, that's where we're kind of doing the death checking. So if player dot health is less than or equal to 0, we stop the music and play a sound effect, and we sort of do the death update loop rather than the main game loop. And then we reload the level. So probably what we'll need to do is give the player some sort of death state, give them some initial velocity to allow them to go flying off the screen, sort of downward off the screen. And yeah, maybe kind of like, maybe rather than checking players' health here in main, we'll be checking the player's state to see if they're dead. That feels like a little bit more, something a little bit more like encapsulation, if you want to use like an OO metaphor for it. We'll just kind of like, because health is kind of like something that's internal to the player. Whereas like state, I feel a little bit better like exposing that. Or if we wanted to be really dogmatic, we could probably have like an is dead method, but I don't think I want to go that far. Yeah, so let me do some refactoring. So that mostly required changes in the player file. So let me kind of walk through. Actually, let me show you what it looks like first. You may very well have seen various versions. It required a lot of me tweaking the velocity of the player, like the initial velocity, and also the way gravity pulls him downward, and the way we sort of like throttle the X velocity. So I wanted to have the player kind of be knocked backwards and up slightly before falling down. So what that looks like is this. We'll let these three trees kill me. So I think that looked pretty good. You can kind of see like he gets kind of like knocked back and up, and then gravity pulls him down. So that's not bad looking. Let me show you. Let me show you my Pokemons. Let me show you how that looks in code. All right. So like I said, most of the changes were in the player file. So the first thing that happened was I needed to add a VY, like a Y velocity for the player, because that did not exist previously. The next thing is in update. So this is the player's main update function, and as you remember, like what this function does is check the state and then call the corresponding update function based on whatever the player's state is. So in the sort of main update function, I'm looking to see if health is less than 0 and they're not dead yet. So kind of what this says is, you know, if the player has just realized that they are died, that they have died, here's what we do. So we set the state to dead. So this little conditional will only execute once per death, because once this state is set to dead, this part won't happen again. We update the frames. So I included the right frames to draw our sort of like splayed out player sprite. And we set some VX depending on the player's direction. So, you know, either 4 or -4, depending on the player's direction. And I gave the player some initial negative Y velocity, which in the Pico-8 axes means the player is going to go upwards at first. So the next time, this will only execute once. The next time we pass through update, the player state is already dead, so this will trigger here, and it'll call the update dead function. This is a bit of a hack, so you'll notice like I didn't include the state check in our big old conditional here. I sort of return early. This is kind of because like I was doing some finicky silliness with this VX value to help tweak the baddie's VX, and I didn't want that to sort of like impact anything else. Actually, you know what? Maybe I don't need this. Hold on. I think I can fix this. Give me just a sec. Okay, sorry about that. I started to explain a hack and then I realized I didn't need to do the hack. So let me take you back a sec. So I was like, let me rewind here. What I had been doing is returning early here if the player state was dead. The reason is because when we kill the player off, we give them some initial VX value, which we had been using to tweak the baddie velocity depending on the player's velocity. The problem is that at the top of the update loop, I was setting this to 0 as part of like the logic to like basically when the player stopped walking, it would stop sending that value to the baddies to tweak their velocity. Because if the player's not walking, we don't want the baddies to like be controlled by some velocity, right? Um, the issue was that like when we went through this loop, it would always kill the VX, and so the initial VX that we set for the player to throw them backwards was being nerfed. It was being set to 0. The fix for this, so yeah, so I had basically had this hack where like I said, okay, return early so that we don't trigger this VX reset. The fix for this was just to change the logic. So I was able to include the dead call in the regular functionality here. And then I will talk about, yeah, let's talk about that now. So I added this get hinted VX function. So previously, um, when main called the baddie manager update, in order to sort of tweak the baddie's velocity, I was just passing in player.vx. What I did was I wrapped that in this get hinted VX function so that we always pass something, but main and the baddie manager don't just get the value directly. They get like some, yeah, they have to like call this function to get it. And the way it works is, oh mercy. Sorry, quick refactor. What I did was in this hinted VX function, I check a few things. If the player is walking and if they're in the sort of space distortion field in the middle of the screen, then I return some value depending on whether they're walking left or right. Otherwise, I just return 0. So by sort of like encapsulating all this logic in this function, I was able to simplify a lot of the checks and not need as many hacks. So yeah, you can see we're using that value in main here. Anyway, to get back to the dead thing, when we initially kill off the player, we give them some x and y velocity, this vx and vy. And so for every frame, we're updating the player's draw location based on those values. But we want this to be sort of like they fly up and backwards, but gravity pulls them downward, and air resistance will slow that initial backwards blast or whatever. So I'm scaling Vx by 0.8 each time. This sort of allows it to mimic the sort of air resistance. And Vy, because I initially set a negative value to pull the player upward, we want to add to this, and that kind of simulates gravity. That's what's going to pull the player downward. It's a very poor simulation of gravity, but it's a simulation. I also capped it at 10. I just noticed that if I didn't cap it at something, it very rapidly got out of control, and the player like just zipped right the heck off the screen, right to the center of the earth. So again, what this looks like is this. So we'll let these guys kill me off, and we'll fly backwards and downwards. Oh, and there was one other thing I forgot to mention. So you might remember when we were drawing the player sprite, or you might have noticed that, so our player sprites are, for the most part, 8 pixels wide by 16 pixels high. But because we sort of went with this diagonal shape, this sprite is 2 by 2. So we need to tell Pico-8 to draw the right dimensions of sprites. So in our case, we set default values to be 1 tile wide by 2 tiles high. That's dim x and dim y. And only if they're dead, we change dim x to 2. Right? And then when we call sprite, rather than passing in hard-coded values, we are passing in dim x and dim y. And that's what allows us to draw properly. So one more time, because I'm quite happy with how this turned out. Okay, it'll be cool when the apple hits and it flies backwards. Oh man, that looks fantastic. I'm so happy about that. All right, so that makes the deaths, the player deaths, a little bit more cool looking. We've got a couple of cases where the player takes damage. One of those cases is when they're in the hug of death. And I do want to add like some sort of visual cue or cues for that later. But the other time when the player can take damage is through projectiles. Right now, the only projectile we have, and the only one we may end up having, is this boss throwing the apple. So if we take a look, bam, the player takes a little bit of damage. We'll take one more. Watch the health bar. Bam. So that's all well and good, and there is a sound effect behind that. But I would like to also add some invincibility and like some hit flash. So similar to the way what happens when we hit the boss. Let's see if we can sneak a hit in on the boss here, in between apples. Bam, kind of like that. So we already have the logic for this in the boss. So what I'm thinking of doing is just stealing that almost verbatim and applying it to the player because I like the way the flash looks, right? So yeah, I think it's about time to do that. All right, that was pretty straightforward. Thankfully, we did most of the hard work with the boss invincibility. So in the player's reset function, where we kind of set all those initial values after they die or get to a new level, I'm setting this invincible property to 0. And I want this to be the amount of time that the player will be invincible. So of course, when they first like spawn or start a level, they're not invincible. They're definitely vincible. And then in the update function, the top level one, before we delegate out to the various states, so before the big old if statement here, where we're kind of like going to the different update functions, because invincibility sort of like lives above the rest of the state machine, it's sort of like it's like orthogonal to the different player states. I'm checking it here and doing stuff with it here rather than in each of the individual states or in some of the states. So if they're invincible, which we determine based on if this value is greater than 0, like there's some time remaining on the invincibility clock, then we subtract dt from that value and we take either that value or 0, whichever is larger. We did the exact same thing with the boss too, and this is just to prevent the value from going negative, right? So it's kind of like flooring the value at 0 no matter what happens. Then in the draw function right here, this is what I've been doing when I want to flash a sprite on the screen. I don't know if there's a better way to do it, but this is what I usually go with. So right at the top of the function, before I do anything else, the first thing I'm doing in draw is I'm checking to see if the player is invincible or not. Then I'm doing a little bit of basic arithmetic. So because the invincible value here is generally going to be quite small, it'll be like, let's say we set it to a second, it's just going to decrease from there. So it'll be a small decimal value, a small floating point value. I multiply that by 100 because I want a bigger value. And then I take the floor of that. So this is just going to give me an integer, right? And roughly between 0 and 100, at least I believe that's what it's going to end up being. And then I take the modulus of that by 2. And so when we're taking the modulus, remember, we're just like looking at the remainder of this value. So the result of that is that, as every time we call draw, the draw function, this is going to be either 1 or 0, or 1 or 0, right? Whether invincible times 100 is even or odd, So you can think, to make it simpler, let's say we just set, let's get rid of the fancier stuff here. Let's say we set invincible to be like 100 seconds, right? And as it counted down, we took the mod of 2. And that would mean that every second the player would be drawn, and then, or sorry, every other second the player would be drawn. So they would be drawn for a second, disappear for a second, be drawn for a second, disappear for a second. But because this value is like updating much more quickly, and it's smaller, and we're multiplying it by 100, the flash is going to be a lot more frequent, right? So because if mod 2 returns 1, if it's greater than 0, we just return from the draw function early. That means we're just going to skip drawing the player like once in a while, right? Again, if invincible was a huge number like 100 seconds, it would work out to be, I think, every second we would just not draw the player. But here it's going to be a lot more frequent. So what that looks like is, let's let the player get hit. Oh wait, let me make this larger. So if we let the player get hit by an apple, you'll see they start to flash. And for the initial value, I set that to be quite high. So let me show you. What I ended up doing in the code was for the deduct health method on the player, I'm passing in an extra value here, an extra parameter called flash. Because as we described at the beginning, we don't always want the player to flash, only for certain kinds of damage, right? Only when they take an apple to the face or the knees, we want them to flash, right? So I want that to be like configurable. So if that is the kind of damage where we want some hit flash, then we'll set invincible to, and I set it to a huge value here. I set it to 10 seconds, and I'll explain why that is in a minute. But basically, when this happens in main, we look for deduct health. You can see in the part of the code where we're checking for projectile collisions here, I'm passing in this true value to tell it to flash. The other place where we call deduct health is actually in the player spot. We can find that. You can see this is where we're updating the hugged state for the player. And so in this case, we don't want the player to flash, so I'm passing in false in that case. So anyway, getting back to why I set this thing to be 10 seconds, because that seems like a ridiculous value. What I wanted to check was, I wanted to give the tree, the boss, enough time to throw another apple after he hits me the first time, so that I can make sure that the apple doesn't actually do any more damage. So let's like restart. We know, or we'll resume. We know the player is invincible and the player is flashing. So we should see the apple actually just pass right through us because we're going to be flashing for a long time. And there it goes. And you can see that no additional damage was taken. Our guy can just throw apples. Oh, I was going to say all day, but he got us with the third one. So I guess it's an apple every 3 seconds or so. So yeah, this is kind of what we wanted to see. We wanted to just make sure that, so initially, we disappeared. Initially, I wasn't letting the apples pass through, right? I was basically like letting the batting manager remove the apples when they impacted the player, and the player would just not take any damage. But I felt like visually, that was kind of lame because then the player might be like, wait, did the apple hit me or did it not hit me? Whereas if the player is invincible and the apple passes through, it seems quite obvious in that case that like, okay, like, yeah, you didn't take any damage. The apple just like went right through you, bro. So yeah, so that's what I ended up with. Let's take out this boss. Ooh. Oh, right, I'm still invincible. Yeah, so I'm obviously not going to leave the 10-second invincibility. In fact, let's change that now before I forget. So I'll set that to 1.5. That's probably fine. Let me just test that real quick at 1.5 and make sure it looks good. Okay, we're flashing. Oh yeah, that's a little bit short, but maybe it's okay. Let's make that 2 seconds. I think 2 seconds should be fine. One, two. Yeah, that feels good. That feels about right. And at this rate, even at the slowest boss configuration, like each apple will still hit. Um, so that kind of makes sense. I guess in the faster case, if the boss starts throwing them more quickly, they could potentially pass through. But I think, yeah, 2 seconds seems reasonable for now. So let's leave it there. All right, thank you all for watching, and as always, thank you so much for the time that you spend checking out these videos. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you're getting something out of them, even if that's just a little bit of entertainment. Next time, we're going to be doing some graphical effects, so no particles per se, but kind of things in a similar vein. So it'll be kind of a graphics heavy episode. I say graphics heavy, but I'm a terrible pixel artist, so I mean, you know, keep your expectations low, as I usually say. Anyway, thank you again for your time, and I hope everything is good for y'all, and I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.